Hi, my name is Mary Beth Lee, and I'm an Intel analyst with the Vertex project. For today's demo, we're going to walk through using Synapse to help us process an open source report. We'll pretend that we're back in December 2020 and Mandiant, then FireEye, just released a blog detailing a supply chain attack against the Solarwinds Orion IT management platform. As an analyst, I want to make sure that I'm able to capture the blog and the findings that Mandiant shared, perform some of my own research, and then share my findings with my leadership or with my clients. The first thing I'm going to do is fork a view. Forking a view is going to give me a scratch space in which I can do my work. I'll still have visibility into all of the data and the annotations that are in the underlying production level view. However, all of the changes that I make, whether it's adding or annotating data, those are all going to be contained within my forked view. At the end of this research task, I can go through and I can review all those changes. I can make any corrections to any errors that I may have made, and then I can actually go and merge that data down to the production level view. If for whatever reason I decide that I don't want to keep this data, I can also go ahead and just fork my view. So I'll name this view OSINT since that's what we're working on. And right now we are in that forked OSINT view. From here, I'm going to go over the tool that we have called Spotlight. Spotlight is a relatively new tool that we have that's good for processing reporting. It allows you to upload either a PDF version of a report or submit a URL, and Spotlight will go out, grab the HTML code, and create a PDF for you. Either way, you'll end up with something that looks like this, where you have your report on one side, and then you have a list of indicators on the other. And when you upload a report to Spotlight, Spotlight will create a media news node to keep track of that report for you within Synapse. It'll also go through and scrape out indicators from the body of the report itself. These are the indicators that you see on the side here. While Spotlight will scrape out indicators from the report itself, I also might identify some indicators when I'm reading through the blog. For example, I might decide that as I'm going through, this is a URL that I really want to capture, which it looks like Spotlight didn't scrape for me. So I'm going to go ahead and add that myself by just highlighting the URL and click on it, go to create node. It'll give me some options of suggested nodes. I don't see the one that I want to create, so I'll go to other and I'll type in the one that I want. And I can go and make some edits. It'll pull that defanging for me. And I want to go and pull out, there's a space from the line break. And then I can just add the node and create it there. In addition to creating nodes, whether I create them or whether they're nodes that Spotlight scrapes out, you can also add tags. One of the things that's really helpful about Spotlight is it will show you the nodes that you're re-encountering. For example, this file-based node that I just clicked on, we can see on one side where it first appears within the blog, and on the other side, we can see the details of the node itself. Now, this was a node that we had already processed when we were doing some other open source reporting, which you can tell by the tags that you see on the side here. This is data that we're actually re-encountering. We use tags for a couple different reasons within Synapse. Some tags, like these rep tags, we use as a way to keep track of assessments, whether it's a third-party assessment, such as US CERT saying that this file-based node is something that they associate with Sunburst activity. We also will use tags to keep track of our own assessments. For example, if we decided that this node was related to a threat cluster that we're referring to as ABC, we'll tag this node with cnothreat.abc. This helps us later when we re-encounter that data, such as we're doing here. We're able to tell from the tags that this is something that we're re-encountering and who reported on it and what malware family, what activity, or what threat cluster they associated this indicator with. We also use tags as a way to organize data, which is what we're doing with this VTX story Nightwatch tag at the bottom here. All of the data that I work with during my task today, I'm going to tag with vtxstory.nightwatch just as a way to keep track of those nodes. This will be particularly helpful later if I ever want to lift all of those nodes together. I can do so just by lifting this tag. In addition to creating nodes through the Spotlight tool, whether it's Spotlight scraping them in or me creating them myself and using Spotlight to facilitate that creation, I can also do some other additional actions. For example, I can apply tags to nodes. I can just select the node. I can go to add tags here and it'll give me an add tag dialog box to enter the tag that I want to add. I can also do some enrichment from Spotlight itself. For example, if I wanted to pull in additional data about this domain, I could use a tool that we have called PowerUps. PowerUps are something that either allows us to extend the functionality of Synapse or In this case, it's going to allow me to query external data resources and actually pull in data related to this domain. If I wanted to run a power up on this domain, I might use a power up to pull in additional data about this domain, including whois records or DNS data or passive DNS data, or maybe even files that communicate with this domain. One of the ways that I could run those power-ups is by selecting the domain, clicking on it and going down to actions, and then I'll get a list of all of the power-ups that are capable of providing data for an INET FQDN form. I could run these power-ups from Spotlight, and then by the time I'm back in my research tool and running some pivots and running some queries, the data from those power-ups will be there for me to encounter. But lastly, the nodes that we create through Spotlight, whether we add them or Spotlight scrapes them out, these are all going to be modeled, connected to the media news node that represents the blog itself. This allows us to easily see what nodes the blog references, and for the nodes themselves, we're able to track those indicators back to the source, back to the blog that noted them. Finally, I can run queries. Finally, I can query some of the data, whether it's the media news node or the specific nodes in here from Spotlight. In our case, we're going to go and actually query that media news node representing the blog, and this will bring us over to the research tool. So here we have our media news node that represents this blog. When we click on it, we'll be able to see the details of this node on the side. One of the things that you'll notice about this node is it's actually this kind of pink color here. This is due to the tag that I've applied, my VTX Story Nightwatch tag. We have a tool called Workspaces that allows us to apply color coding rules to tags, which is something that I like to do as a way to help bring certain nodes to my attention if they have a tag that I'm interested in. If we go over to our Workspaces tool on the side here, we can see some of the color coding rules that I've put in place. Things like anything that has been reported as being whitelisted, that node will show up as white. It's something that's easy for me to visually recognize without having to click on the node and read the tag. Anything that has a CNO threat tag or a CNO mal tag, anything that I've associated with a threat cluster that we've identified or that we've set as malicious is also going to show up in kind of like these pink and purple colors. And that's an easy way for me to see that those are tags that we've already made an assessment about as them being malicious, and they'll be brought to my attention a little bit more quickly. So from here, we might want to take a look at the blog itself. One of the things that we noted about the blog was that besides the indicators that are included in the body of the blog itself, is that it also has a link to a GitHub page where they note that they include some additional indicators. If we go over to that GitHub page, we can see that two of them are CSVs, one with hashes and the other with network-based indicators. These are things that, because they're not in the body of the blog itself, we wouldn't have been able to pull in through the Spotlight tool. So we're going to want to pull in this data. For these two CSVs, we're going to use something called the Ingest tool. The Ingest tool is particularly helpful if you're doing any sort of bulk data ingest, like hashes or network-based indicators. When I upload one of these CSVs, this is the hash CSV, I'm going to see a preview of the contents itself here. I can go through, and if there's any sort of typo or maybe a space that I don't want, any sort of editing that I might need to make, I can go and double click and just make it here on the fly, rather than having to go and correct the CSV and then re-upload it. Besides seeing a preview of the CSV contents, I also have the ability to write a little storm code here. This is going to tell Synapse how I want to import this data, what kind of nodes I want to create, what properties those nodes should have. And then at the end, I'm going to apply two tags. One of them is going to be a tag noting the date that FireEye reported this data, and the other is going to be my VTX Story Nightwatch tag, which is just going to help me keep track of this data as part of my research project. I can go ahead and run the ingest. It will run pretty quickly. And we can take a look at the network-based indicators. So when I uploaded this CSV, this is the preview that I saw. One of the things that we're going to be doing here with the storm code that I wrote is that instead of just doing kind of a straight ingest where we're just creating domain nodes and IP nodes, we're going to actually be combining some of the data that's in the different columns to create things like DNS CNAME records or DNSA records. We can create a DNSA record that shows the FQDN. It'll include the IP address that it resolved to, and then we'll use the first scene and last scene to put a timestamp on that to show when that DNSA record was seen. Again, I'm going to use my storm code to apply those two tags, the one showing when FireEye reported this data, and the other that's showing that this is part of my VTX story night watch task. So we can go ahead and run that ingest. It will run pretty quickly. And then we can go back over to the research tool. And from here, we're going to actually traverse this light edge that is linking our blog to the data that they published. And this is indicators that we created in Spotlight and we created in the ingest tool that we'll see here. We can see there are 160 nodes total. So besides using the Spotlight tool and the ingest tool, we also could use something called scrape, which is an easy way to go out and scrape in certain indicators. Like, for example, we might scrape in yara rules that they also included in GitHub. We can see the yara rules here as nodes. We can hover over the body to see what the contents of the rule included. However, we also have a tool that's for yara rules is a little bit easier to see them. It's called the yara grid. And this is really our centralized yara detection engine. We can see the index of all the different yara rules that we have in our Cortex. And if we click on one like this one, for example, we'll actually see the rule itself. We can go in here and make edits if we need to. If I wanted to create my own yara rule, I can actually do that through here as well. It supports color coding so that you can see more easily see the syntax. You can validate the syntax just to make sure that you haven't made an error there. It also supports versioning in case I'm working with a rule and I'm doing multiple iterations to try and tweak the detection. I can keep track of those different versions here. In addition to showing the rules, it also keeps track of matches so that I have a history of certain matches. For this rule specifically, I can see the different files within the Cortex that actually match on the rule. And if I had different versioning information, I could have which version of the rule it specifically matched on as well. For some indicators, I might decide that rather than importing them through either Scrape or Spotlight or through the ingest tool, these might be things that I just want to create as a one-off node. For example, this named pipe here might be something that I just saw and it's a single node, so it might be something that I just manually decide to create. In that case, I always have the option of going to an add node dialog box that we have here. In this case, if I knew that I had a named pipe that I wanted to create, I could start typing in pipe. It'll give me the options, the two node options that I have. I can click on one and it will actually walk me through how to create that. In this case, I just have this value that I would need to put here, and I can just go ahead and add the node. I noted in the Spotlight tool that we're able to do things like apply tags and run power-ups to enrich data from Spotlight. Those are things that we're also able to do from the research tool where we are now. For example, if I wanted to apply additional tags to these MD5 hashes, I could select them all, right-click, and just apply the tags that I wanted to note. In this case, I already have them tagged, so we'll just leave them. Additionally, if I wanted to pull in additional data through power-ups, I could select them all and go to actions here, and it will show the power-ups again that are capable of providing additional data for MD5 hash. And this would be a way for me to pull in additional information about them, whether it's from VirusTotal or hybrid analysis, anything that might later help me with my research. Now, all of the data that we're looking at here is displayed through something called tabular mode. I particularly like tabular mode just because it makes a little bit more sense in the way that you can display data. I find it helpful in that you can sort columns that have certain properties. You can also hide them. You can reorder the display. When you click on something, you can also see the full details of the node, including the tags on the side. And you can toggle certain things if you decide to display a property, or if you decide that you don't want to display the property, you can click it so it's gray, so it will not display. However, there are also different data visualization options, which depending on your preferences or depending on what task you're working on might make more sense for you. One of them that we'll take a look at is something called the force graph mode. Force graph mode is particularly helpful if you're interested in seeing how data does or does not connect within the graph. For example, here we'll go ahead and we'll lift all of the nodes that FireEye published in that December 13th, 2020 blog by searching that tag. When we lift this data, we can see that there's some nodes here that are attached, that these are linked together in the graph, but then we do have some nodes that are just floating out by themselves, like this file base name. So we can see what's connected and what's not. There's a lot of the same actions that you can do in the research tool or things that you can also do within the force graph mode. For example, you can select certain nodes to see what the data is there. You're also able to apply tags. If you wanted to go ahead and click on a node and go to add tags, you can run enrichments through node actions, clicking on a node and then selecting the power up that you'd like to use to pull in additional data. You can also explore out. For example, if I wanted to double click on this node and there's additional nodes there, it will pivot out to those nodes. And I can see what those nodes are. I can also go ahead and I can undo, I can pivot back. So these are all the nodes that FireEye had released with their blog. If we search for our VTX Nightwatch tag, we'll see the additional nodes that we brought in through our power-ups. This is additional context that we were able to bring in. And one of the first things that we'll notice is that there's a lot more connections between the nodes. We're actually able to use additional data to connect the dots, as it were, and help better illustrate how these indicators that FireEye released are related to each other. Another data visualization option that we have is the statistics mode, which if we go ahead here and we lift all of the file bytes nodes that FireEye has reported and attributed to APT1, specifically looking for those that have a compile time set, we can see the different breakdowns of this data in stats mode. Stats mode can be particularly helpful if you're doing any sort of pattern of life analysis. For example, if we look over at this table on the right here, where it shows the days of the week when most of these files are compiled, you can see that it looks like the majority of the activity took place on a Monday through Friday schedule. Saturday and Sunday, by comparison, were a little bit more quiet. We can also see maybe a more of an overview time frame in the whole. You can also see more of a large-scale time frame. This currently is toggled to day, but we can make it to something a little bit less granular, like if we wanted to see over the different months that this data was compiled. We can see that the earliest file bytes node compilation date that we have dates to 2004, and it looks like the most recent is in 2013. Finally, we also have a geospatial mode. Geospatial mode is helpful for any sort of geolocation analysis that you might do. For example, we'll go ahead and we'll lift some IPv4 addresses that are actually Tor exit nodes based on the lat long information on these nodes. We can select specific nodes and we'll actually see the details on the side here and any tags that may have been applied. You can zoom in, you can zoom out. You can also make some adjustments if you prefer dark view. You can change that visualization there. If you prefer satellite view, you can do that as well. We'll switch it back to street view for us. And any of these visualization modes are something that you're able to export and add to something that we call a story. Stories is our internal native Synapse reporting tool. We go over to stories here. We can actually search for the story that we created on Sunburst, and we can go ahead and lift it. Stories gives us the ability to export data from Synapse into stories and pair it with prose and actually create a report. If we go and we move this to our preview mode, we can see what this report would look like in its final iteration. We have the ability to add a title, include images, add text, but most importantly, we're able to add data directly from Synapse. For any analyst who's done reporting and has had to export data from one system and then import it into whether it was an Excel file or whether it was a Word document, stories can be a really nice change because it's very easy to move data over from Synapse, and it's also easy to make sure that whatever data you're preparing to report on, whatever data you're including in your story is the most up-to-date representation of what you have in Synapse. If I was working on this story and let's say that I used a query to pull this data here, and I pulled all of the domains that have that rep FireEye Sunburst tag on them, and I wanted to make sure that I had all of the domains that FireEye reported and attributed to Sunburst, I can go over to the menu here and I can either refresh the nodes and make sure that all of the domain information is correct, that I have the correct zone and host and this zone properties, or I can go and actually refresh the query that I used to pull this data and make sure that I have all of the domains that carry that tag. Stories is highly collaborative, so I can give access to another one of my colleagues and they can come in here and they can work on the story with me. If they're doing a review, one of the things that they would be able to do is actually grab the query that I was using to pull this data. So if anyone had any question about what query I used to lift these domains, they could go and they can copy the query, and then they would be able to run that query in the research tool and be able to see what I had asked to try and lift these domains and pivot around that data. Similarly, if they wanted to leave me a comment, let's say that they identified a typo or something in one of my prose sections, they could always leave me a comment here. I would be able to reply. I could resolve the comment. When I'm ready to share my report, I have the option of sharing it with someone who has access to my Synapse instance or someone who it does not have access. If it's someone who has access to my Synapse instance, I can go to story settings and I can just go ahead and add that permission for that user. I can give them permission as a viewer, or I can give them editor or even admin. If it's a specific role that I want to share with, I can also go and I can add, analyst role or maybe executive role or whatever roles that we've created for users. If I'd like to share my story with someone who doesn't have access to my Synapse instance, I could do so by exporting my story as a PDF and then giving them that copy. Stories can be as formal or as informal as you want. I like stories because it gives you the option of pairing prose and images along with data. However, there are other ways that you can share data that you've been working on. For example, let's go back to tabular mode here. Let's say that I'm interested in sharing all of the nodes that I've tagged as being part of my Vertex story Nightwatch research project. I can go ahead and use the tag to lift all of those nodes. And if it's someone who has a Synapse instance, I can actually export these as a nodes file. It will give me the option of what tags I might want to include, and I can export that as a nodes file. Then the recipient would be able to go to their Synapse instance and import that nodes file, and they would have the same data that I was looking at. If I'm decide that I want to share data with someone who does not have access to Synapse, but I would still like to give them structured data, I can always lift that data. And let's say I want to share these 10 INET IPv4 nodes with someone. I can always go lift those nodes and go over to the menu on the side here, and I would be able to export this data as a CSV. Then I'll have a CSV that I can share with that other researcher. They can upload it to whatever tool they might be using and have that structured data that I shared with them. So from here, I've already gone through, I've created the media news node and imported all the data from the blog. I've enriched that data, I've tagged that data, I've created a story, or I've shared my findings through sharing a nodes file or exporting a CSV. So when my task is done, at this point, I have the option of keeping the data or getting rid of my view. If I decide that I'd like to keep the data, I can go ahead and I can merge it down into the production level view here. Conversely, if I decide that I'm not interested in keeping any of this data, I can go ahead and just delete my view here.